You are watching the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. The Humanities 101 Foundation welcomes you.
Welcome back, Nacho Nuts. I am really glad that you are with us today. I want to begin today's episode with a quote from one of our favorite academic philosophers and mythologists here on Nachos, Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell said, "We must be willing to let go of the life we have planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us." And that quote feels especially important because so many of us are taught to believe that a good life is a perfectly mapped life, a tidy life, a life that unfolds according to schedule, expectation, and plan. We're told that if we work hard enough, think clear enough, mask well enough, or push ourselves far enough, life will eventually line up exactly the way that we imagined it would. But for so many people, especially neurodivergent people, disabled people, people carrying grief, burnout, uncertainty, or change, life doesn't always unfold according to blueprint. Sometimes the plan falls apart. Sometimes the version of success we were handed doesn't fit who we really are. Sometimes what we thought was the destination turns out to be a detour. And sometimes that detour is not failure at all. Sometimes it's the beginning of a more honest life. Campbell's words remind us that letting go is not the same thing as giving up. Letting go can be an act of trust. It can be a way of making room for a life that is more sustainable, more humane, more surprising, more aligned with who we actually are instead of who we are told to become. And that's not always easy. There is grief in letting go of old plans. There's real sadness in releasing timelines, identities, expectations, and dreams that once meant something. We should be honest about that. I mean, if you think about it, but there can also be a freedom in it. There can be relief. There can be a quiet beginning of true self-acceptance. So today, I want us to sit with that possibility together. What if the life waiting for you is not a lesser life, but a truer one? What if the unexpected turn is not the end of your story, but the place where your real story begins? So that's where we are headed today. This week, for myself and a lot of other people, is spring break. And for once, the calendar is not packed with edges, at least sharp edges. I only have a few meetings and one scheduled TV appearance, which means something that doesn't happen nearly as often. I have a little bit of breathing room. I might even take a walk today. And maybe that's part of the point, because spring break is often treated like it has to become something, a productivity sprint, a catch-up week, a chance to fix everything that feels unfinished. But maybe this season can also be an invitation to loosen our grip a little, to stop measuring our worth by how efficiently we fill every open space, to remember that rest is not wasted time and quieter weeks are not empty weeks. So for today's episode, I want to reflect on that and what it means to meet an unstructured moment with intention instead of pressure. What does it look like to let go of the break we thought we were supposed to have so we can receive the one that is actually waiting for us? What might become possible when we stop trying to force every pause to justify itself? And that's the spirit of today's conversation. And yes, it's a spring break episode, but it's also something more. It's a chance to pause long enough to notice what has been unfolding beneath the surface over these first months of the semester. When life slows down, even just a little, we sometimes get to see more clearly what has been forming in us all along. And for me, part of that has been the joy of rediscovering how astonishingly human humans really are. Our history, our resilience, our creativity, and the long, complicated story of what it means to become who we are. So I want to use this space to reflect on some of the new and genuinely exciting research I've been encountering over the first half of the semester that I haven't had a chance to share with you yet. Research about humans, human history, and humanity itself. The kind of work that reminds us that our story is bigger, older, stranger, and in many ways more beautiful than we often give it credit for. And maybe that's a good point, or exactly a good pause, what a good pause can offer us. Not just rest, but time to gain perspective. Not just recovery, but time to rediscover wonder. What I keep coming back to this semester is how often the newest research does not diminish our humanity, it deepens it. One of the most striking studies I came across this week was released through the YCU Advanced Medical Research Center and led by Professor Takashi out of the Department of Physiology at Yokohama City University Graduate School of Medicine in Japan. The study was published in Molecular Psychiatry on March 5th and then featured in a March 8th Science News release. And in simple terms, the researchers used advanced PET scan imaging to watch what was happening in the living brains of people with treatment-resistant depression before and after a certain substance was introduced, ketamine. What they found was remarkable. Ketamine's rapid antidepressant effects were tied to changes in AMPA receptors, which are part of how brain cells communicate and adapt. The changes were not random. They were region-specific, and those shifts closely matched improvements in depressive symptoms. The study included 34 patients with treatment-resistant depression and 49 healthy comparison participants. What makes this important is that it gives researchers direct evidence for something that had largely been inferred from animal studies before now. In other words, scientists are getting closer to seeing in real time in an actual human beings how a fast-acting depression treatment may work in the brain. The authors argue that this could eventually help identify biomarkers to predict who is most likely to benefit, which opens the door to more personalized and humane mental health care. And that's exactly where this connects so beautifully with NACHOS. Because one of the things we return to again and again here in this space is the reminder that people are not broken machines. We're living beings shaped by story, environment, memory, body, chemistry, hope, and even relationship. This research does not reduce us to molecules. It shows that suffering has biology, yes, but it also, that biology is dynamic. Change is possible. Healing is not imaginary. The brain is not a static verdict. It's responsive, adaptive, and honestly full of mystery. And that matters for how we understand ourselves. It matters for how we talk about depression. It matters for how we talk about neurodivergence, disability, and the long history of human beings trying to make meaning out of pain. Too often, people are told that if they're struggling, it's a moral failure, a weakness, or a lack of effort. But research like this reminds us that human experience is embodied. Our inner lives are not just in our heads, they're in our nerves, in our history, in our communities, in our relationships with the world around us. And maybe that's one of the most hopeful things that this story and Spring Break can offer us. A little space to remember that being human is not just about productivity or performance. It's about discovery. It's about wonder. It's about learning over and over again that we are more complex, more resilient, and more changeable than we even sometimes believe. And that brings me to another story that caught my attention earlier in the week, because it reminded me of the understanding of the mind is not always about escaping reality. Because when you mention that word ketamine, that's what often people think. But when we're looking at research like this, sometimes it's about getting a better grip on what reality is, how we experience reality. and what helps us live inside it with a little bit more steadiness and a little bit more hope. And so again, a study that was published in March 2026, the American Chemical Society highlighted this new research that came out of the Journal of Medicinal Chemistry by a team led by DeMartin, Mattarelli, and Manfredi. And these researchers developed modified forms of psilocin, the active metabolite connected to psilocybin, and in early mouse studies found signs that these compounds may preserve important serotonin-related brain activity while producing fewer psychedelic-like effects. What makes that so fascinating is that the deeper question is the deeper question that's underneath it. For years, public conversation about psychedelics has often focused on the altered perception, the vivid experience, or the idea of stepping outside of ordinary consciousness. But this research points in a different direction. It suggests that the therapeutic promise may not depend entirely on dramatic hallucinations or a total break from the everyday world. Instead, it may be possible to help people suffering from depression by supporting the brain's chemistry in a way that is gentler, more stable, and perhaps more clinically practical. In other words, the goal is not necessarily to leave reality behind. It may be to help people re-enter reality with a stronger foothold. And that connects beautifully to our NACHOS themes. So much of this project is about helping people understand themselves with more compassion and more honesty, not romanticizing suffering, not pretending the mind is simple, not assuming that healing has to look dramatic to be real. Sometimes healing is not fireworks. Sometimes it's clarity or relief. Sometimes it's the quiet return of being able to face the world as it is. And that matters for how we think about depression, disability, and the fragile, resilient work of being human. So as we move through this episode, I keep circling back to that idea. Maybe the deepest discovery about humanity and the deepest discoveries in general are not just the ones that help us transcend experience, but they're the ones that help us understand it better, the ones that help us hold reality more gently, more accurately, and with a little more hope than before. And what's so compelling about these first two stories is that they're both asking in very different ways what it means to experience the world as a human being. The first reminds us that the brain is not fixed, hopeless, or closed off from change. And the second suggests that healing may not always come from escaping ordinary life, but from being able to return to it with a steadier mind and a clearer sense of self. But together, they point towards something deeply human and deeply NACHOS. Our experience of reality is not simple, passive, or automatic. It's shaped by biology, perception, chemistry, memory, and meaning. We're not just brains in jars observing the world from a distance. We're embodied creatures, constantly interpreting, filtering, and making sense of what is around us. And that matters because it means the work of understanding ourselves is bigger than symptom management or self-improvement. It's about asking how we come to know anything at all, how we know what we feel, how we know what is real, how much of our lived experience is direct, and how much of it is constructed through the remarkable complicated systems that make up human perception. Those questions do not pull us away from reality. They pull us deeper into reality. They remind us that to be human is not just to live in the world, but to participate in the ongoing creation of how the world is sensed, interpreted, and understood. And that brings me to another story that opens this lens even wider, because it challenges one of the oldest assumptions many of us were taught, that we, as humans, move through the world with 5 or 6, depending on when you learned, senses. According to a February 9th, 2026 feature in Science Daily, based on work in The Conversation, There was research at the University of London School of Advanced Study and Insight that looked at humans maybe having 33 senses. Now, in collaboration with Oxford, this study found that these senses might include not just sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing, but balance, proprioception, interoception, sense of agency, and other overlapping ways of sensing both the outside world and the inner state of our own bodies. And honestly, this changes the conversation in a beautiful way. Because if we've been misunderstanding something as basic as how many ways human beings experience reality, then maybe humility is the right response. Maybe reality is richer than we assume. Maybe the experience of being alive is more layered, more mysterious, and more interconnected than the simple categories that we inherited from our 7th grade science teacher. And to me, this feels very nachos. It reminds us that human beings are not shallow creatures moving through a flat world. We're meaning-making beings, sensing beings, relational beings, constantly receiving and interpreting far more than we realize. And maybe this time, spring break, is a perfect time to pause long enough to notice that the world is not only there to be survived or escaped, it's also there to be sensed, wondered at, and understood more fully. And that, in many ways, is the real story of humanity. We're constantly learning new things. And just as importantly, we're constantly being asked to let go of old ideas that no longer hold up. And that's not a flaw in the process. That's not a breakdown of science or knowledge. Knowledge grows because human beings are willing to test assumptions, challenge inherited wisdom, and revise what we thought we knew. Sometimes that can feel unsettling. We like certainty. It's nice. It's comfortable. We like the comfort of thinking the map is already finished. But real discovery rarely works that way. Real discovery asks for humility. It asks for risks. It asks us to admit that some of what we were taught was incomplete, overstated, or simply and outright wrong. And honestly, there's something hopeful about that. It means that we're not trapped by yesterday's misunderstandings. We're allowed to grow. We're allowed to refine. We're allowed to become wiser, not because we got everything right the first time, but because we kept paying attention. Science does this. History does this. Good teaching does this. Good self-understanding also does this. We revisit, we re-examine, we rethink, and in doing so, we move a little closer to truth. And that matters for our lives just as much as it matters for research. Sometimes we carry old stories about ourselves that are no longer true. Stories about what we can do, what we deserve, how healing works, what strength looks like, or what kind of future is possible for us. Part of growth is not only learning something new, but also releasing something that's false and relieving your soul of that burden. Sometimes wisdom is additive, but sometimes it's subtractive. Sometimes becoming more fully human means gathering better information. Sometimes it means clearing away the bad information that's been weighing us down. So maybe that's part of the invitation in this week's episode too. To recognize that change is not always evidence that we were foolish before. Sometimes change is evidence that we are alive, awake, and still learning. And to me, that's a beautiful thing, because the goal is not to pretend that we've already arrived at perfect understanding. The goal is to stay open enough, curious enough, and grounded enough to keep growing as the picture becomes clearer. And that openness to revision does not just apply to mental health research or the science of perception. It also applies to the deepest questions we ask about who we are as a species and where we come from. Sometimes the most meaningful discoveries are not brand new inventions, but new ways of dating, interpreting, or understanding evidence that's been with us for years. That, too, is part of the process. We return to old questions with better tools, better methods, and a better perspective. And suddenly, what we thought we knew begins to shift. And that's what makes this next story so powerful. It takes us back to one of the biggest human questions of all. How old are we, really, as modern humans? A 2005 report released through the National Science Foundation highlighted research by Ian McDougall of Australian National University, Frank Brown of the University of Utah, and John Flegel of Stony Brook University, published in Nature on February 17, 2005. And this may seem like it's an old story by date, but to a lot of us, this is going to seem like new ideas, and it will be clear in the next story. So 20 years ago, Homo fossils from Ethiopia were redated, and they were found to be about 195,000 years old, right? And so when you think about the age of humanity, this pushes back the age of Homo sapiens by roughly 40,000 years. And what I love about that, in true NACHOS fashion, is that it reminds us that humility belongs at the center of human knowledge. For a long time, people worked with the best information they had. They had better dating methods come along. The evidence was revisited. And the story changed, not because science failed, but because science kept going. And that's a reminder for us all. Growth often looks like correction. Wisdom looks like revision. And our human story, like our personal stories, become richer when we are brave enough to truly understand and admit that we don't know it all. And in some ways, that is the perfect place to go to for our next story. Because once we begin to accept that human knowledge is always unfolding, we can also start to see that the story of humanity is not just about bones, fossils, or biology, or even carbon dating. It's also about meaning. It's about memory. They ask anthropologists, what's the first sign of human development? And often they will say the first healed femur bone, right? It's not always about writing. It's about connection. It's about the long, slow development of our ability to symbolize, record, and share what matters. And so the earlier story had us kind of rethink how old modern humans may be. This story helps us rethink how deep our roots of communication and abstraction may really go. Published February 25th from Saarland University in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Benz and Dutchwick found 3,000 geometric signs carved in around 260 Paleolithic artifacts. And the researchers found that these markings were somewhere between 34,000 and 45,000 years old. And they're not random decoration. Instead, they appear to be structured sign sequences with measurable complexity. And their information density was found to be comparable to Proto-Cuneiform, one of the earliest known writing systems. So this is extraordinary because it suggests that long before formal writing, as we usually define it, human beings were already doing something deeply familiar, trying to preserve meaning outside of the body, trying to leave behind a pattern, a signal, a record. Maybe not full writing in the modern sense, but certainly something more intentional and cognitively rich than simple ornament. And that matters because it reminds us that our ancestors were not merely surviving 45,000 years ago. They were thinking symbolically. They were organizing information. They were creating systems to hold and communicate something beyond the immediate present moment. And that feels very important for a nachos conversation. So much of what we do here is rooted in the belief that human beings are makers of meaning. We tell stories, we create rituals, we leave traces for one another. We build bridges across time and space. This research suggests that impulse goes back astonishingly far. The human desire to encode experience, to make thought visible, to carry meaning into the future, may be one of the oldest things about us. And honestly, there's something beautiful in that. Even tens of thousands of years ago, people were not only living, they were interpreting life. They were marking it. They were saying in their own way, this matters enough to leave a sign. So when we put this story next to the others, a larger picture starts to emerge. We are a species always learning, always revising, always reaching for better ways to understand reality, ourselves, and each other. We are creatures of perception, adaptation, and symbolism. We don't just exist in the world. We're trying to know it. We're trying to record it. And we're trying to hand something of it on to others. And maybe that's one of the deepest truths about humanity. We're always becoming. And we've always been leaving evidence of that becoming for a very, very, very long time. So all this brings me back to spring break, not as an escape from life, but as a chance to notice it again. One of the gifts of a quieter week, even one that still has a few meetings and, other things tucked in it, is the chance to step back from the usual rush and to remember how much there is to wonder about. During the semester, it's easy to get locked into deadlines, logistics, problem solving, and the constant motion of keeping everything afloat. But a pause, even a partial one, can reopen something in us. It can make space for reading, not just as work, but as discovery. It can make space for thought, for curiosity, for reconnecting with the deep and beautiful strangeness of our own humanity. And maybe that's part of what I've been rediscovering over the first months of the semester. The more I read, the more I'm reminded that humanity is not a finished story. We're still uncovering who we are, how we became who we are, how we perceive the world, how we heal, and how we make meaning of our lives. And there's something profoundly grounding in that. In a world that feels loud, reactive, overconfident, research humbles us in the best possible way. It reminds us that reality is richer than our assumptions and that people are often more complex than our labels. And that understanding is always still an unfolding. So this week, I'm trying to lean into that spirit, not the spirit of cramming everything into a moment of productivity, but the spirit of paying attention, of being here now, of maybe reading a little more slowly, of letting ideas breathe, of waiting, of remembering that wonder is not just a distraction from life. Sometimes it's the point. And it's one of the ways we return to it. And maybe that is worth offering to all of us nacho knots, because rest is not only about stopping, it's also about seeing. Maybe a break can be a return to perspective, to curiosity, to a larger story that holds us when the smaller daily pressures start to feel overwhelming. Maybe this week can remind us that to be human is not just to work and worry and push through, It's also to ask questions, to keep learning, and to let ourselves be amazed. Because sometimes the life waiting for us is not only a different schedule or a quiet calendar. Sometimes it's a deeper way of seeing the world we were already in. And maybe that is part of what this space is for too, Nacho Knots. Not just reflection, but connection. Not just wonder, but community. And so if these conversations in this space mean something to you, I hope you'll help us keep it growing. Please like and follow and share. Donate if you're able, because every bit of support helps us build a more neuro-affirming world and helps these neuro-affirming conversations happen. More accessible storytelling and more spaces where people can feel seen, valued, and understood. And I also want to invite you to keep an eye on what's ahead for this spring. On April 14th, 2026, I'll be a part of the third annual Beautiful Minds Conference at the University of Michigan's North Campus Research Complex in Ann Arbor. This is a gathering centered on elevating neurodivergent voices and supporting mental health, well-being, and belonging. The conference's mission emphasizes education, empowerment, inclusion, collaboration, innovation, and community building, which feels deeply aligned with everything we try to do here at Nachos. So you can check out that information on U of M's website. Registration is now open Saturday, I believe. Then the very next day on April 15th, we'll be at the Voices in Action Self-Advocacy Day in Lansing, where self-advocates and allies gather at the state capitol to speak with lawmakers and push for stronger, more neuro-affirming and disability-affirming policies and programs across the state of Michigan. The events listed by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services from April 15th, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can check out and register on that website. But we're going to be talking about issues like healthcare, housing, jobs, and transportation. And I am going to be specifically working with people on how to craft their stories, build their networks, and build coalitions and policies with legislators to make real change happen. Now, as we sit with everything from today's episode, one of the clearest themes is that being human means living inside of an unfinished story. Again and again, we saw that our knowledge keeps expanding. Whether we're talking about the brain, perception, early symbolic communication, or the deep timeline of human origins, the pattern is the same. We're still learning, still revising, still discovering that reality is richer and far more complex than we really understand, and definitely than we believe. We also explored the idea that growth often requires release. Sometimes we have to let go of old assumptions, old frameworks, or old certainties in order to make room for better understanding. And that's true in science, where outdated ideas are replaced by stronger evidence, but it's also true in life. Part of becoming more fully ourselves means recognizing when a story no longer fits, when an inherited idea no longer serves, or when a narrow understanding of reality gives way to something deeper and more humane. And underneath all of this was a quieter but more important reminder. Rest can help us notice. A pause in the schedule can create space, not just for recovery, but for perspective. Spring break and breaks in general, in that sense, become more than time off. They become a chance to reconnect with wonder, to read a little more deeply, and to remember that the world is still full of mystery. The studies we discussed today do not just give us information. They invite humility. They invite curiosity. And they invite awe. Taken together, these stories remind us that humanity is not small, simple, or static. We're adaptive, meaning-making, sense-making beings. We're constantly interpreting the world and being changed by what we learn. Maybe that's one of the most hopeful things we can remember, that to be human is not to have everything figured out. It's to keep growing into a fuller understanding of ourselves, each other, and the reality that we all collectively share. So from here, Nacho Knots, we move into the part of the episode where we take everything we've explored and let it settle a little deeper. Because here on Nachos, affirmations are not about pretending everything's easy. They're not magic words we say to avoid reality. They're reminders, gentle, grounding reminders. They help us take big ideas and the things we talk about and bring them back into the body, back into the day, and back into the life we are actually living. And this week, that feels especially important. We've been talking about how much there still is to learn about humanity, about the mind, about perception, about our ancient past, and even about reality itself. That can be exciting, but it can also feel humbling. So these affirmations are here to help us hold the humbling feeling with tenderness. They remind us that not knowing everything is not failure. Being unfinished is not weakness. Growth, revision, wonder, and rest are all part of what it means to be human. So if you're in a place where it feels okay, take a breath with me. Not a perfect breath, just an honest one. Doesn't even have to be deep. And let these land where they need to land. I don't need to know everything to be worthy of wonder. That one matters because so many of us were taught to treat uncertainty like danger or weakness. But uncertainty can also be the beginning of discovery. You don't have to have every answer in order to live a meaningful life. You're allowed to be curious. You're allowed to still be learning. Letting go of an old idea does not mean I have failed. It means I'm growing. This affirmation connects so deeply to today's episode. Science grows by revising itself. Human beings grow that way too. Sometimes healing means releasing old assumptions about the world. Sometimes it means releasing old assumptions about ourselves. It's not weakness. It's wisdom in motion. Rest helps me notice what rushing makes me miss. Spring break gives us a way into this conversation for a reason. When everything is crowded and loud, it can be hard to see clearly. A pause can help us return to wonder. A quieter moment can help us rediscover what is beautiful, mysterious, and still unfolding around us. My humanity is not measured by productivity. It is measured by presence, growth, and connection. That is the one we need again and again. You're not a machine. You're not a checklist. You are not only valuable when you're producing, performing, or proving something. You are a living person with a mind, a body, a story, and a place in this world. I'm allowed to change as I learn. Maybe this is the heartbeat of the whole episode. We change when we encounter better information. We change when we see ourselves more clearly. We change when wonder softens our certainty. And that change is not something to fear. It's one of the most natural parts of being alive. Reality is richer than I sometimes remember, and I'm allowed to meet it with awe. This affirmation invites us back to the bigness of things. The world is more layered than we think. Humanity is older, deeper, stranger, and more beautiful than we often realize. And sometimes one of the healthiest things we can do is let ourselves be amazed by that. So if you need to carry anything with you from this week's episode, maybe let it be this. You're still learning, and that's okay. You're still becoming, and that's beautiful. You don't need to have the whole map in order to take the next step. Sometimes it's enough to stay open, stay grounded, and remember that wonder itself can be a form of healing. And with that, Nacho Knots, let us come down gently, not with pressure, not with a need to tie everything into a perfect bow, just with a little more room in our minds and in our hearts for what we explored today. A little more room for wonder, a little more room for uncertainty that does not have to scare us, a little more room for the possibility that being human means learning, revising, resting, and beginning again. So wherever this episode finds you, I hope it leaves you with a softer grip on the things you do not have to force and a deeper trust in the parts of yourself that are still unfolding. I hope you carry forward the reminder that you do not need to have all the answers to live with meaning. You don't need to have a perfect plan to have a real life. And you don't need to become someone else in order to be worthy of care, rest, discovery, and hope. Keep taking the next step that is yours to take. Keep making room for curiosity. Keep making room for gentleness. Keep making room for the life that may be waiting for you, even if it doesn't look exactly like the one you planned. So until next time, Nacho Knots, please remember this. Your mind, it matters. Your stories, it matters. And you matter. I'll see you next week.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week. The views and opinions expressed in this video are solely those of the creator and do not reflect the views of any institution, employer, or affiliated organization.